Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening. Here I want to say thank you to Mr. Taufik Jati Murtaya that has allowed me to present my English assignment, and the title is Useful Expression for Presentation. Before I start my presentation, I want to introduce myself. My name is Tsania Taskia Nabila, student number 1811201005. I'm a biotechnology student of Aisyiyah University of Yogyakarta. And then the topics that I'm going to present to you is comparison between Indonesia and Japan culture. So the goal of this presentation is to know about differences between Indonesia and Japan culture. So my presentation is divided into 4 parts. The first is preliminary, and then main presentation, conclusion, and closing. So for the preliminary, please pray basmalah to start our presentation. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. And then for the main presentation, I want to start with the general information that based of Indonesia and Japan culture. So as we know that Indonesia is an archipelago country. This country has many islands, 6 main islands, and 17,000 individual islands. Yeah, and then the maps is spreader than in Japan. Yeah, in Japan, the maps or the geography is not as large as Indonesia, so it gives an impact in culture distributions. So yeah, as we know that Indonesia has many traditions, religions, or tribes. The tribes include Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. But in Japan, just Mongoloid. Yeah, mostly just Mongoloid. So about the maps and the geography or geopolitics in Indonesia, between Indonesia and Japan gives an impact in cultural distribution. So the next is majority in both religions. So as we know that in Indonesia mostly the people is Muslims. So we very rarely to look the people that drink alcohol or hug or kiss with their couple because of the Indonesia ethics. But in Japan, mostly the Japanese is a Shinto. So Shinto is belief of Buddhism that affects on the way of thinking and acting in Japanese people. Yeah, so Shinto give impacts in the social life in Japan. So the Japanese and the Indonesians has different characteristic. Okay. Oh, and then about the traditional clothes. Yeah, about the traditional clothes in Indonesia, there are 34 provinces. that every provinces has their own traditional clothes. Example in Maluku, in South of Kalimantan, uh, they have they have their own traditional clothes. So many types of traditional clothes in Indonesia, but in Japan just one type. The name is Haori for men and Hakama for women. Also in Indonesia the climate is tropical. So if you go to Indonesia, of course, you have to wear cotton clothes because in in this country the season is often hot and sometimes rain. In Japan is according to Japan's season. Example when in Japan season is winter, of course you ought to wear a jacket winter. Ought to wear a jacket winter. Okay. And next about the transportation, as some surveys revealed that Indonesia mostly like private transportation. So as we know that in that on Indonesian streets the condition is very crowded. Yeah, and in Japan, otherwise in Japan, mostly like public transportations such as bus, train, bicycle, or even they like to walk. Yeah. So the streets conditions in Japan is not as crowded as Indonesia. Okay, next about education. In Indonesia, the government ruled every children to do 20 years education required in public school from kindergarten until senior high school. But otherwise, in Japan, uh, the people in Japan like to do private education. Also, in Indonesia, the bachelor program are held by the range of age 18 until 24 years old. But in Japan, 60.4% people in Japan uh, are doing are doing tertiary education such as uh, diploma, undergraduate, and graduate in the range of age 25 until 34. But and then in Japan also in the range of 25 until 25 to 64 years old. Yeah, the bachelor programs in Japan are held by the range of age 25 until 64 years old. Okay, next about in eating. So if you go to Indonesia, you will often look for Indonesians to eat with hands. Yeah, before it they wash their hands and then they to pray and they eat with right hands. Yeah, and after it they lick their fingers. Okay, but in Japan, they mostly like to eat with spoon, fork, or knives, and often say before it, itadakimasu, or in English means happy eat, and cheers for beverages. If you go to Japan, it's banned to lick fingers after you eat in front of others. So uh, it's very terrible if you do that in Japan. Next, about the last is about basic country economy. As we know that Indonesia has many rice field and then many islands. So my majority of jobs in Indonesia is farmers and are farmers and fishers. Yeah, so many rice fields and islands. But nowadays Indonesia becomes an industrial country because many manufacturers are built, especially are located in Jabodetabek or Jakarta, Bogor, Depok, Tangerang, and Bekasi. Okay, that's basic country economy in Indonesia, but in Japan, largely scientific and technological based. Okay, in Japan, often produced uh, robots, many robots, yeah, and as we know that uh, many of scientific journals are published by Japan scientists. Yeah, so yeah, because of the basic country economy in Japan is scientific and technological based. Okay, that's my main presentation. I want to give you the conclusion about my presentations. So the differences between Indonesia and Japan are the following points. So the first is the maps and geopolitics or geography. In Indonesia, the geography or the maps, yeah, is larger than in Japan. So it gives an impact in the cultural distributions. In religions, mostly in Indonesia Muslim, but in Japan Shinto. In traditional clothes, Indonesia has many kinds of traditional clothes because each province has their own traditional clothes. But in Japan, just one type. And then about transportations in Indonesia, mostly like to use private transportations, but in Japan, public transportations, education, the government of Indonesia ruled every children in Indonesia to do 20 years education public school required. But in Japan, they mostly like to private education. In eating, Indonesia mostly like to eat with right hands, but in Japan, they like to eat with spoon, fork, or with equipment, not with hands. And the last about basic country economy in Indonesia, economical, maritime, and nowadays uh, becomes an industrial country. Sorry, yeah, industrial country. But in Japan, largely scientific and technological based. Okay, that's all my presentation. Before I close my presentation, I want to give you a quote. So the purpose of our lives is to be happy. So don't be sad. Always pray to Allah because our destiny is depends to God, or in Muslim it depends to Allah. Okay. That's my presentations. Thank you. Uh, Hopefully, you can get some benefits or some knowledges about my presentations differences between Indonesia and Japan culture. Thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.